Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I got a couple bins that I need to feed. They're the two ones over on the edge of the shelf. They're European night crawlers. They're both somewhere in the 120, 130 day age range, I believe. It was 8 days ago when we last fed these systems. They got some lettuce leaves, I think, a variety of different types of vegetables and stuff like that. But today they're not getting any sort of produce or anything like that. Today they're getting coffee. I got 2 days worth of coffee here in this tray, and I've got 3 days worth of coffee here in this thing, and here we've also got 3 days worth of the filters too. So besides a nice big nitrogen boost of coffee, there's also a little bit of paper going in. And then I think there was a good amount of leaves still visible in these bins, even though there's been no new leaves added for maybe 3 or 4 weeks now. There is still signs of leaves and their stems and stuff, so I'll probably be trying to do my best to mix all that stuff into the bedding as well to help that stuff break down too. So I've already got my glove on, I'm almost set to go. I'll just move these things aside, get one of the bins up on the bench, and we'll get to work. We're going to begin here in the younger of the two systems. I believe that in this system there's just a slightly smaller number of worms than in the older one, but not by much. I was actually sort of even questioning that thinking last time we were in here, because that's been my thinking for some time now, but I do recall myself even questioning that last time I was in here working on the bin. I was thinking to myself, is it really a smaller population? Because as I went through here, it did seem like there was quite a number of worms. These look like some sort of tomatoes where the inside of the tomato has been nibbled out and is just the outer skin of it. Is that right? I think it is. So I did have a few tomatoes like this in the garden, and a couple of them might have gone bad, might have been used as worm food, but I don't remember. So you can see here too, right? This is the stuff that always makes me wonder, when is it going to finally break down, all these little sticks that come along with the leaves. And I think that's part of the reason it's probably a good idea to start mixing all this stuff in, because for it to sit out here and remain dry is pretty much ensuring that it's not going to get broken down by the worms. So I think the bedding that we're going to accompany today's feeding with is simply going to be the stuff that we scraped off the top surface. Get it down where the material's nice and damp and give it a chance at softening up and breaking down. Let's just dig ourselves a little bit of a pit to put today's feeding into. I guess while we're at it, we'll have a chance to examine some of the things that went in prior. This looks like a scallion. I just sort of unrolled it. Piece of scallion onion. Doesn't look like it's making a lot of progress. It's still very damp. I could smell the onion odor. We'll see what other kinds of leftovers we can come up with. Even though that scallion might have been placed in here pretty recently, the mango seed, this has got to be at least a month's worth of progress. Something like that takes quite a bit of time in a worm bin to break down. So we're already encountering a few leftovers. I would assume that these are maybe the skins of potatoes. Now that I saw these potato skins, I was just reminded that there were potatoes in the last feeding as well. Or at least that's kind of how I remember it. I did screen the last video quickly to just try to refresh my memory on how things went in here last time we checked in. It's an avocado shell. It's been pretty much nibbled clean. And there's still the shell, which will also break down in time, but it's a much tougher substance, as you can imagine, so it'll take time. I'm looking at all these little white specks everywhere, too. I'm having to assume that it's all the grit that I've put into this bin over time. Because a lot of times when I feed, I'll also include a little bit of grit to go along with it, since it helps the worms in their digestion. And there's like little specks of stuff all over the place. I use the crushed eggshell as grit in my bins. So when I see little white specks throughout the material, I kind of assume that it's just leftover grit. This might be the shell of another avocado. It's kind of tough to tell. Considering that there was a fairly fresh chunk of onion remaining as far as leftovers, it first got me thinking that, hey, maybe this bin is a lot slower than I was thinking, and that I shouldn't really expect to see a lot of progress on the last feeding that they received. But it does seem like, with the exception of those slow composting shells and seeds, as well as for whatever reason that piece of onion right there, everything else has been more or less nibbled away. So at first I thought that we were going to be in for a whole bunch of leftovers in here, but after 8 days they've done a really good job breaking down all the stuff that they received. I'm sure if I keep poking around I'll find some other things that are probably leftovers as well. This is an avocado pit. Usually it's perfectly round, but a chunk of it is already sheared away, it seems. And in time, one of these things, even though it starts out as hard as a marble, like a rock, it does eventually become softer. You can break it up and crumble it. Naturally, now that it's in this form, it's going to be much easier for the worms to break it down and finish it off. So I like to try to get it to that point as quickly as possible, rather than just leaving it as a really hard marble-shaped sphere of, you know, all this potential yummy food right inside that the worms can't get at. I don't know what this is. For some reason, it tells me it's a chunk of avocado, which is gotta be 3 weeks old at this point, making me wonder why aren't they eating it. So whatever, doesn't matter. We've pretty much created a nice big hole down here to put today's feeding into. So I think we'll give them everything that's in here. Since it's the younger system, it's got a little bit more time as far as I'm concerned. It probably will be in service longer than the older bin. The older bin will be hitting its 15th feeding today at 140 or whatever days old. I can't remember its exact age. But that other bin that we're going to feed right after this one is one of the candidates for being sort of taken out of composting mode and geared up for migration, harvesting, whatever you want to consider it as. So at some point soon I'll, probably stop feeding in that system. Today we'll give them some coffee, but we'll give them whatever's in this tray right here. No paper for them to break down, just the food. And we'll leave the paper for these worms in here to nibble away at, since they've got a little bit more time to do away with it. I don't know, I thought about shredding that paper up into little bits, but at this point, the heck with it. We'll just leave it, and we'll take all these other bits of leftover food and surround the feeding area with that stuff, and then, as we talked about earlier, we'll finally give all this leafy material that's been sitting out on the surface a chance at breaking down by putting it down in there with the foods. I don't know, I'm not sure what to expect when I put in just coffee like this. To me it seems like somehow a boring kind of a food item, because I never really see any worms mobbing the coffee or going nuts about the coffee. It all seems to go away over time, because I do use a good amount of it in my feedings all the time, because there's always coffee waste being produced here at this house. And you would have to guess that they probably like it, since they do away with all of it. And that is probably true. It's just I still feel like it's somehow a boring kind of a food item. I don't really feel like I see the worms getting too jazzed up about this stuff when I put it into the bin. So I don't expect much either. I don't expect a worm ball next time I come back into the system. I just kind of hope that a good portion of the food that they got was consumed and hopefully isn't there as leftovers. But you never know with coffee, right? I mean, this stuff could be blending in. It could be, half of this stuff could just be coffee. Who knows, right? No, I doubt it. This bin's really coming along nice. Lots of castings, as you can see. We should maybe just take a quick peek out on the outer edges. Maybe not going too crazy, tearing things up, but still, just to get a sense of how things are. I mean, when I run my fingers down in there, it feels nice and cool and damp. And you can see we've pulled up a few worms that seem to be a-okay with the consistency and the texture of the material out here on the edges. And that includes its moisture level too, so that's good. Let's just do a quick check on this edge as well, just to get a confirmation that things are in fact looking pretty good in here, and they do look good. Lots of castings mixed in, lots of bedding in here too still, so we want to start seeing all this bedding get broken down as well in time. So this turned out pretty good. We've got a few sticks and stems out here on the surface. I don't know what to do. Do I just try to collect them up manually and get them under the surface? I don't know. Perhaps just another tilling up like this during the next feeding would be a good idea. Continuing to get this stuff out on the surface down low where it has a chance to get damp and broken down. I guess the one drawback to covering up with stuff like paper and cardboard like I do in my systems is that the stuff out on the surface does get a little bit dry. So it doesn't get the attention it should get from the worms. I guess I've always got the opportunity to put plastic coverings too, which would increase the moisture level throughout, but I think we're actually pretty good here as far as moisture is concerned. All right, let's get into the other bin and get them fed too. All right, very similar bins. They've got, you know, the same size container. They feel about the same as far as the weight is concerned. I can't really tell from the height of the material within the bin. I mean, this could be just the exact amount of material in both bins. It almost feels that way just from the weight. But like I said, this is going to be this bin's 15th feeding, so technically it has received a higher number of feedings. If all feedings were equal and everything else, then this should theoretically have more material in it. Definitely looks a lot more broken down though too, right? You gotta admit, there's just not as much material floating out on the surface as we saw in the other bin. I think for some time now we've been making an actual effort here to give all this stuff out on the surface an opportunity to get worked on by the worms, get down low within the bedding. So we'll do the same here as we did in the other bin, is get all this stuff down within the moist castings material below, and hopefully it'll give it a chance to get broken down, all this sort of stuff. All right, so same story here. I believe they were both fed in a very equal fashion. This is kind of dry. It must have been out on the surface, so I'm not able to break it apart, but I think it's just another chunk of avocado pit like the one we crushed in the other bin. So let's start pulling stuff back here. Right away you could tell that this bin is much more densely concentrated with casting material. Not as much bedding floating around as we saw in the other container. I'm wondering what kind of leftovers we're going to find. Looks like a very similar kind of leftover, right? We got a mango seed here. A lot of times I don't bother what's going on inside of one of these things. Other times I'm curious and want to just pick it open and see what's happening. So a couple things slid out of there, including a few worms. You know, I think one of them might have been what remains of the seed, so we'll just throw that back in there and let it remain intact now that we've totally torn it apart. So the feeding area here in this bin seems to have a greater number of worms hanging out throughout it. And it's pretty much all castings. Here we go, another chunk of leftover food. Oops. I'm flinging castings all over my bench here. I'm going to have to clean up afterwards. What a mess. So we're just making a little bit of space that we could dump today's feeding into. We're encountering a few similar leftovers to what we found in the other bin, but certainly not much. As far as the potatoes and whatnot, it does seem like they've done away with the majority of it. Here and there I find something that appears like it might be the peel of a potato. So I'm assuming that that's just part of the leftovers from the last meal, but paper thin, hardly anything remaining of it. This is a little piece of corn cob that I slice up the corn cob into little bits to help it break down. Sometimes I'm in the mood to crush those and help them break down. Other times I'm in the mood to just leave them be and see how long it takes for them to break down without any help. Man, this material is so nice. Doesn't seem like it's going to need a lot of time to break down all the remaining stuff in here. Although, you know, there is a good amount of it if you think. Every handful, lots and lots of castings, but also good amounts of lingering leftover bedding material in here too. So even if I were to maybe, you know, treat today's feeding, the 15th feeding, as the last feeding of this bin, and start driving this thing towards harvest and migration of the worms and everything, I do believe it would take a a good amount of time for the worms to actually break down all the remaining scraps of bedding and stuff that's floating around in this system. So there is a good amount of it. So to help that stuff break down, what we'll do is what we did before too, is we'll just take these little collections of materials that we found on the top surface and leftovers that we found down in the feeding area, and use them as the foundation for today's feeding. Give all the stuff a nice chance to get a little bit more damp, a little bit more worm traffic, hopefully a little quicker to break down that way too. I guess if I can find sticks and stems, I should get them down there as well. They're always the slowest thing, you know? So I think this agitation probably helps a lot. Alright, just a little bit more of this stuff. We'll stir all that stuff into the edges after we inspect the outer sides. See how things look, and stir in the materials over there too. We'll just spread the coffee around, and it almost blends right in with the rest of the castings. You can't even tell that it's food. So hopefully the worms like it. Hopefully they'll do away with it quickly. It's spread out nice and evenly across the feeding area too, so it's like in a nice thin layer. Should make it pretty easy for them to access it in large numbers from all directions. And there do seem to be a large number of worms in here. We saw a good number of them as we turned up the feeding area. I'm just curious to see what type of worm population we'll find in the outer edges of these bins here. Since I feed down the middle all the time, there's not a lot of moisture happening on the outskirts of the bins. It does seem like, you know, dry material, just like the surface. If it's dry down here on the sides too, it's just going to get ignored to a certain degree, and we don't want that. We want the worms working the material in the bin everywhere. Here's another chunk of corn cob. Let's make sure it's down low where it's going to get some good attention. But yeah, this stuff looks so good. But I know it's riddled with all kinds of bits and pieces of stuff that still needs time to break down. So even if we're not going to feed this bin anymore, if this 15th feeding becomes its last feeding, and we start steering this thing down the road of just foraging, it does seem like the worms will have plenty of stuff to nibble on down in here for some time, even if they get nothing fresh. And then they could turn all this stuff into castings too, all these little bits of leftover and everything as well. Wow, it's all just castings out here, really. Not much as far as leftovers go. I guess we'll blend in some of this material that we have out on the surface into there as well. Very nice. Definitely like the way this bin looks. It's definitely kind of in that home stretch territory, kind of like it's near the end, I think, you know. It's kind of a, what is it, a baseball expression, the home stretch? Or maybe it's just a general term meaning you're near the end. You're approaching the goal, and it's not far from being ready to be harvested, I think. So yeah, maybe this will be the last feeding for this bin as well. It doesn't seem to make sense to keep throwing stuff in here if we can just let the worms turn their focus around back down onto the stuff that's already surrounding them in the bin, all stuff that's pretty nicely broken down already, ready to be consumed by the worms. So I'm just worrying about these worms getting a little bit razzled by my kind of rough handling of their material when I come in here to feed or to check on them. So hopefully we don't end up with a whole bunch of worms trying to flee the container. Sometimes I'll set up a time lapse if I'm suspicious that the worms might be kind of in that mood, that they're going to start climbing the walls and trying to jump out of the container. Sometimes I'll just set up a time lapse to just sort of watch for a while immediately after I've completed the check-in, and sometimes I get some interesting insights into what's really happening down here. So I don't know, I might do that with these worms as well. I'm getting a little bit paranoid because in some cases I've seen a lot of worms trying to, you know, jump out of the bin, and if they do that, unfortunately they're going to end up in a place that's not going to be very good for them. They'll just sort of dry out and die, and that's something none of us wants, right? All right, so this could be the last feeding for this bin. And I don't think it would take that much for this thing to kind of get to that broken down stage where the material is pretty much all castings. There's a lot of leftovers in here, so it would take them some time to break it down. But I don't know. This, I think, might be the end of composting for this system, and it might be the beginning of foraging. So I don't know. I'm starting to worry about all these little climbers. I'll have to go get the other camera that's really good for time lapses and set it up here while I get to work on editing today's video. All right, everyone, that's today's check-in with my worms. The European night crawlers are now fed after 8 days since our last check-in with them. In the case of this bin, I think we're going to be switching from composting to foraging. So we'll see how things look going in the future. Next time we check in, who knows, a week from now, 10 days from now, we'll have to see how things are coming along in here. All right, everyone, thanks for watching, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.